Our story starts in 2003, from the germ of an idea within the designer's head. Over weeks of discussion, rough sketches and technical calculation, these have progressed into a fixed design, complete with accurate, detailed drawings. It is time to move from the drawing board to the workshop and turn the idea into reality. First, plugs or full-size models must be created from which molds will be made. Molds are used to form fiberglass parts from which the first boat will be assembled. A proper ceremony ensures the project will be successful. The finish must be flawless, as every defect or error will be faithfully reproduced in every boat. The hull plug is blue, and the inside of the mold will be red. The first hull emerges from the mold like a butterfly from its chrysalis. This is the hull for Venture, the vessel that is the subject of this story. Drums of resin, planks of wood, coils of wire, and hundreds of components are blended together by skilled craftsmen. The ability to think upside down and inside out are illustrated by the flying bridge part in its mold. The sketches have become reality, and we get our first proper look at the Fleming 65. A huge mobile crane lifts her into the test tank. To ensure that she floats to her lines and to allow for equipment testing. The interior is cleaned up and packed for shipment. Now named Venture, she is loaded onto the transporter. She leaves forever the place of her creation and starts her journey through Taiwan's busy traffic to Kaohsiung Harbor. Here, a mobile crane, at a cost of $10,000 per day, lowers her gently into seawater for the first time. We finally see her underway, under her own power. With sea trials complete, on Christmas Eve 2004, Venture is lifted from the soil of Taiwan. Loaded aboard a ship to be transported across the vast Pacific Ocean to San Diego, California. She is driven under her own power from San Diego to Newport Beach, where she is outfitted with electronics. I decide to move her to Canada for further testing and photography. To do this, we take Venture to Ensenada in Mexico. I judge it wiser to ship this as yet unproven design north rather than risk a hazardous journey against the prevailing weather. We are shipping by Dockwise, a purpose-built Dutch vessel which is in effect a floating, self-propelled dry dock. She floods her ballast tanks to allow boats to enter the central part of the ship, and then closes the stern door and pumps out the water. Just 5 days later, she arrives in Vancouver, and we drive Venture out into Canadian waters. This is Venture's 4th country in 3 months. Summer 2005 is spent in sea trials and evaluating every aspect of her design. In September, we moved to Seattle to present the Fleming 65 to the world at the Seattle Boat Show. Venture is gussied up to look her very best. Remember that sketch of the Flying Bridge console? This is how it looks in reality. With summer over, it is time to take Venture south, this time under her own power, down the exposed coast, back to Newport Beach. We are lucky with the weather, and Venture handles the ocean swells without problem. We travel overnight with brief stops in Grays Harbor and Eureka. We arrive at Catalina Island in 5 days, where we have a date with the staff from a magazine who have flown over from the East Coast to take photos and write an article. Venture returns to her berth in Newport Beach, where she spends the winter of 2006. Dockwise no longer offer service from Ensenada, so we decide to take Venture down to La Paz and the Sea of Cortez to join the ship for transit back to Canada. I was unable to join this trip, but the Fleming crew had an uneventful voyage and are able to rendezvous with the ship in the Sea of Cortez. Shortly after arriving back on Vancouver Island, we set off on our first cruise to Juneau in Alaska. This was to become our regular cruising ground in future years, so I will just point out some highlights. We traveled up the Inside Passage through serene channels. The nights were short. This photo was taken at 3 a.m. We passed dramatic cliffs with magnificent waterfalls. And take Venture for her first navigation through the ice. We spend 3 weeks in Juneau, where it rains every day except for 2. On one, we took a light plane to Skagway, the final town on the Inside Passage, flying past magnificent mountains and glaciers. On the second day, we take a helicopter flight and land on one of the glaciers close to Juneau. On arrival back in Vancouver Island, we take Venture to spend the winter at Delta Marine Services, the Fleming Service Center. Venture serves as a testbed for new ideas and equipment, and during the winter we decide to swap out the main engines to try a different make and model. In the meantime, we receive an emphatic request to attend a prestigious event on the Promenade des Anglais in the city of Cannes in France, where, to our surprise and delight, I accept an award on behalf of the company for the Fleming 65 being selected as the best boat worldwide in her class for the year 2006. During summer 2007, we cruised the Broughton's, a group of islands on mainland Canada opposite the northern part of Vancouver Island. These feature several small, family-run marinas, such as this one where everything is floating and accessible by float planes. Care has to be taken when navigating narrow channels such as this one. Mirror calm at slack, they become raging torrents within a few minutes. We spot a black bear effortlessly flipping over rocks at low tide. We go ashore and explore remote uninhabited islands. Mist lingers over the water as we return to the shipyard and prepare once more to head south down the exposed coast to California. Our entry point into the US is at Port Angeles on the Olympic Peninsula, where we top up our fuel. We round Cape Flattery and are soon in the rough and tumble of the open ocean. Our immediate destination is Grays Harbor, about 90 miles south of the Cape. Grays Harbor is primarily a fishing port, and Venture stood out like a swan amid the local working vessels. After an overnight stay, we studied the weather reports, consulted a routing service, and decided to head back out to sea to take advantage of a narrow weather window to win some progress south before the forecast gales arrived. We decide to make for the town of Eureka and run at 16 knots to make the entrance before dark and enter against an adverse tide. Concentration was needed to negotiate the tricky entrance. We remained weatherbound in Eureka for 5 days, but took advantage of the wait to visit the magnificent coastal redwoods. Walking among these forest giants, many more than 2,000 years old, was an uplifting experience. It is tragic to think that less than 3% remains of the original forests that were here when the white man arrived. The winds continued to rake the hills while we visited Cape Mendocino to watch the waves exploding onto the shore. Forecast much improved, we forsook the safety of the harbour and turned our bows out through the heaving entrance into the open ocean. We passed Cape Mendocino and saw it this time from the ocean side. Overnight the seas subsided, and by dawn the surface was glassy. There was nothing in sight in any direction. An oil rig, ablaze with lights, marked our approach to Point Conception. The cape itself lay a few miles south, and true to its reputation, the wind and waves returned, but this time they came from aft and helped us on our way south. Our route took us through the main shipping channels for the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, with their steady procession of container ships, many traveling at speeds in excess of 25 knots. We passed by the Channel Islands. This is the island of Anacapa. Our reason for making the arduous trek south once again was because we had been invited to be one of the escort vessels for the first so-called FUBAR rally. What's in a name? It's not what you think. It really stands for Fleet Underway to Baja Rally. The rally was a 900-mile voyage of exploration, conceived by Bruce Kessler to encourage less experienced boaters to take part in something outside their normal experience. Boaters who might lack the confidence to embark on such a trip without being part of a fleet. A fleet which in this case included experienced captains and even the designers and builders of the participants' boats. Turtle Bay is rich in wildlife, and as dawn broke the following morning, the bay was a frenzy of activity, with seals, porpoises and birds feeding on waters teeming with fish. This was our third and last overnight passage. And the rain. next day, we travelled 75 miles along the southern coast to Bahia de los Muertos, as the Bay of the Dead. We went ashore to an even more luxurious resort called Casa de los Sueños, meaning the House of Dreams. There are mountains here too, but stark and devoid of trees. This is the desert, harsh and arid, but the adjacent seas bursting with life. Venture now lay at anchor in quiet bays, framed by saguaro cactus. The bones of the landscape reveal strange and wonderful rock formations. We refueled and provisioned in the Mexican town of La Paz before heading across the water to the resort town of Puerto Vallarta on the Mexican mainland. Down the coast to Tenerife, we took the tender through a green tunnel of mangroves to a hidden village on the Pacific shore. Moving on south, the sea was alive with turtles. Now in the lush tropical rainforest of Costa Rica, we arrived at the marina of Los Sueños. Here we took on the all-important fuel for the 650-mile journey to the Galapagos. Not many powerboats make this trip because they lack the range and ability to handle the offshore passage. It was to be almost 1,000 miles before we would refuel again. We headed for the infinitesimally small dot that was Cocos Island, 300 miles away in the immensity of the Pacific. We travelled slowly to conserve fuel, so it was the afternoon of the second day that Cocos appeared first on radar and then arose over the horizon through the rain and thunderstorms. Mist draped the forested slopes, and we felt as if we had arrived in a lost world. We approached Chatham Bay and called the ranger station on the radio. Anchoring is not permitted, and we were directed to a mooring. When the dawn came up like thunder, we found we had a new neighbor. We ran our tender around the point and over a bar into the estuary of the Janeo River in Wafer Bay for a trek through the rainforest to a waterfall. It started with the crossing of a quaint suspension bridge made up of fishing floats. Only 18 square miles in area, Cocos lies in the tropical convergence zone and gets 275 inches of rain a year, which supports a tropical rainforest. The track was rough but adequate and climbed steadily through the lush vegetation.
For the river, please, the river.
At last we reached the falls and were able to cool off under its thundering torrent. The following morning the rain was back, and once more the remote island took on its lost world appearance. We headed another 350 miles out into the Pacific to the Galapagos Islands. On the way we crossed the equator, but Neptune exacted no special tribute. After 2 days at sea, we arrived in Academy Bay of Puerto Ayora on Santa Cruz Island. Our first destination were the Plaza Islands, a few miles north of Ayora. Immediately after going ashore, we had our first meeting with one of the land iguanas for which the Galapagos are famous. These reptiles are about 3 feet long. The tops of these cliffs are a clubhouse for bachelor sea lions. It is hard to believe that these large animals, apparently so ungainly on land, climb these cliffs and seek out their favorite resting sites. As with any club, the senior members have priority and unceremoniously kick out the juniors. Mothers suckle their young with rich milk and nurture them for the first 3 years of life. We were underway before dawn in order to reach our next destination. We headed for Kiko Rock, also known as Leon Domido, the sleeping lion. This remnant of an ancient volcano rises 500 feet sheer from the water. The landscape had a stark beauty. The powdery white sand dazzled the eyes. Crimson ghost crabs scuttled across its surface on tippy toes, like runaway rubies. Venture swung at her anchor on a turquoise sea, framed with lava as black as jet. We moved on to Gardner Bay on Espanola, which is one of the oldest islands in the chain. Sea lions lolled along the beach and paid us little attention. On Floriana, also known as Santa Maria, we met the gorgeous pink flamingos whose distant ancestors are believed to have originated from the Caribbean, although by what means they arrived here is still a mystery. At Puerto Egas on Santiago Island, many marine iguanas were warming their body temperature in the morning sun before entering the cold water to forage for the seaweed, which was their main diet. Adding a splash of color to the black rocks and iguanas were numerous Sally Lightfoot crabs, so named for their ability to skip across the rocks, ahead of, or even in, the swirling waters. This crab is lubricating its joints in preparation for exchanging its shell for a larger size. We anchored in Cerro Brillo and went ashore to walk across the jet-black lava dating from an eruption in 1897. The lava is of a type known as Pahoehoe, which is a Hawaiian term to describe the form shown here. Frigate birds with their 7-foot wingspan cruised effortlessly above us as we headed towards Santa Cruz. First there was one, and then joined by others. They brought to mind pterodactyls floating on a prehistoric wind. This male with deflated courting pouch became our latest hitchhiker. Seymour Island at the northern tip of Santa Cruz gave us the opportunity to observe the courting rituals of the blue-footed boobies. The males woo the females by sky pointing, accompanied by a whistle. Nearby, a male frigate bird has his courting pouch fully inflated. The female is much less flamboyant. Here, a great frigate, with his deflated pouch resembling a red cravat, sits on a nest. On the ground below, a magnificent land iguana is on the hunt for insects. These reptiles are 3 feet long and can go without water for as long as 1 year. We went to see the giant tortoises which give the Galapagos their name, and for this we had to take a car to the uplands of Santa Cruz Island. We now took on 1,550 gallons of fuel as we prepared to set out on the 900-mile transit to Panama. We had an escort of boobies as the last of the Galapagos Islands dropped astern. We were accompanied by one last hitchhiker as evening fell. The following day, we picked up an escort of dolphins. Our weather advisor forecast thunderstorms along our route and recommended that we head east before turning north, but this would have added many additional miles, so we elected to take a straight shot to Panama. The weather looked very ominous, but turned out to be not as bad as it looked. After 4 days and nights at sea, we sighted mainland Panama rising over the horizon under stormy skies. We had burned just over 1 gallon per mile and arrived with almost half our fuel remaining. After the isolation of the 900-mile ocean crossing from Galapagos, Venture arrived in Panama Bay to find it crowded with vessels awaiting their turn to transit the Panama Canal. Storm clouds bloomed on the radar, and AIS was a great assistance in isolating the ships from the clutter.
Distance from Flamingo Lighthouse, 2.3 miles, bearing 112 degrees, over.
Thank you, standing by, Channel 12.
We standing by, Channel 12.
We rafted up alongside a sports fishing boat. Venture provided the propulsion for both vessels. The messenger lines come aboard. This line is used to pull across the blue mooring lines rented from the Canal Authority. Small boats using this technique are referred to as hand-line transits. We approached the first Miraflores lock on the Pacific side. We were sharing the lock with a freighter from Bangkok. The massive gates swung shut behind us. These gates are 6 foot 6 inches thick, 64 feet wide and 66 feet high. They are hollow and buoyant to reduce the weight on the hinges. The lines are adjusted by the line handlers as the vessels rise. 26.7 million gallons of water boils in through the 22-foot diameter culverts, filling the lock in just 8 minutes. There are no pumps involved, and the water rushes in from the higher level in Gatun Lake by gravity alone.
The locomotives are used and attached to the ship by means of steel cables, where they roll the vessel in the center to avoid a hit against the lock wall. The average size ships require 6, larger vessels might need up to 8.
now clear of the Pacific locks and free to proceed independently towards Gatun Lake. The railway, opened in 1855, predates the canal by 60 years and is used to transship containers across the isthmus. Sometimes this is done to lighten the ship to reduce its draft to the limit of 39 feet. The containers would then be reloaded at the other end of the canal. The earthworks you see are the early stages of a scheme underway to construct additional larger locks. The cost is estimated at $5.25 billion. Here we can see the Centennial Bridge completed in 2004, providing a second road link. The new bridge now carries the Pan American Highway. Surprisingly, the Panama Canal runs not east-west, but almost north-south. In fact, at Colon we were west of the starting point of Panama City. We left Colon at the northern end of the Panama Canal for the 600-mile crossing of the Western Caribbean to the Cayman Archipelago. It was the evening of the third day when we arrived on the island of Grand Cayman and were rewarded by a magnificent sunset. We made our way round past the anchored cruise ships to North Sound and tied up at the more protected but rather bleak surroundings of the Cayman Islands Yacht Club, where we later took on fuel from a road tanker. The design of this gate to the nature reserve reflects that of the silver thatch palm, which is the national tree of the Cayman Islands and found nowhere else. Wild orchids display their delicate blossoms, and this iguana is native to the island. With the hurricane season fast approaching, we could not afford to dally, and we were soon on our way once more. The tropical weather took on a menacing appearance as we negotiated the tricky passage out through the reef. Even in the marked channel we had only 3 feet to spare under our keel, and the bottom was very visible through the clear water. We had to deviate around the western end of Cuba through the Yucatan Channel. We had arrived back in the USA in the Florida Keys, at the quirky town of Key West. Just north of Cuba, we felt a slight vibration and suspected we might have picked up something on a propeller. Imagine our surprise and that of the diver when he found this enormous cargo bag wrapped around one of the propellers.
Yeah, man. Gotta take it slow. Welcome to the Western. Told you relaxation is a key.
I know this may not look like much, but it's more than any of you can do. So clap. Everybody go ah! Everybody go, that was amazing. I know.
I have a sing-along for I do the Carl today. Easy skanking, you know you gotta take it slow. Easy skanking, taking it slow. Yeah, man, gotta take it slow. Welcome to the Western. Told you relaxation is a key. Yeah, man, put your foot up and relax. We're on vacation, take a vacation from a vacation. That's that about it.
We now headed north along the Florida Keys to Fort Lauderdale. This was another overnight passage, and we arrived in the bustling city just as dawn was breaking, and made our way through the network of channels to the marina at Bahia Mar. After 3 days, we retraced our way past exotic waterfront properties towards the 17th Street Bridge at the mouth of the harbour. The Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway runs from the Florida Keys to Norfolk, Virginia, and provides a safe inland route all the way up the eastern seaboard. However, progress in parts can be very slow due to the number of bridges which open on a timetable. Wherever possible, we lowered our radio antennas and crept under bridges without them having to open for us, but it is almost impossible to judge bridge clearance by eye alone. A series of inlets links the waterway to the open ocean, and we alternated between the waterway and the open sea. We picked up an escort of dolphins who accompanied us for some distance along the waterway. It was such a contrast to be floating so close to private homes that our shadow was cast across their yards and swimming pools, after being out in the rough and tumble of the open ocean. The barge canal led us to Cape Canaveral, where we passed through a lock into the Atlantic Ocean for an overnight passage to Moorhead Inlet. We did not need the radar to warn us of a serious storm heading our way. It was only too visibly evident as the angry clouds boiled towards us, accompanied by thunder and lightning. The anemometer read 60 knots in the gusts, but fortunately the storm was short-lived. Back in the protection of inland waters, we attracted the following of a huge flock of laughing gulls, which somehow avoided hitting each other as they wheeled and dived to forage in our wake. We spent 1 week at Burr Yacht Sales, the Fleming dealership for the eastern United States, with their new and marvelously equipped marina. But we still had many miles ahead of us and were soon on our way once more up the Chesapeake and passing through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, opened in 1829, and large enough for ocean-going ships. The 3-mile-long Cape May Canal led us through to Cape May Harbor, where we spent 1 night before heading back out once more into the Atlantic and along the coast of New Jersey to New York. Like so many before us, we were welcomed to the great metropolis by the iconic Statue of Liberty. I was struck by the grace and fineness of detail seldom apparent in the pictures of this elegant landmark. From here we will head up the Hudson River, the Erie and Oswego canals, and down the mighty St. Lawrence River. Since we took that first step 4 years ago, venture has brought us many, many miles. Photography has also come a long way over the past 16 years. Succeeding cameras have become smaller, lighter, cheaper, and infinitely better. I'm now down to just this, with the red one used for underwater work. Editing systems have developed too, but it is an ongoing challenge to keep up with the ever-changing technology.